This is Parjanya Sen of the Department of English, Sanada Degree College, Darjeeling. And this lecture is being made available to you by Radio Solution 90.8 FM. Okay, as I've mentioned, these lectures are on the novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and this is intended for the students pursuing their English Honours course under North Bengal University. This novel is part of Core Course 10. Okay, I have already discussed some of the important events which occur in the novel, and I've given you a background to this particular novel. Okay. In the fourth part of the novel, we see that Jane decides to leave Thornfield Hall after her marriage with Mr. Rochester is foiled. Okay. Jane travels as far as Thornfield from possible with the little money that she has saved. However, she accidentally leaves her bundle of possessions in the coach that she was traveling. She unsuccessfully attempts to trade her handkerchief and her gloves for food, but she's unsuccessful in doing so. Exhausted and starving, she eventually makes her way to the home of Diana and Mary Rivers, her cousins, but she's turned away by the housekeeper. She collapses on the doorstep and she's given herself up for death. Okay, she's rescued by St. John Rivers, who is Diana and Mary's brother and who is a clergyman. He rescues her and he offers her a teaching position at a nearby village school. Jane also becomes good friends with the sisters Mary and Diana. Okay, the sisters soon leave for governess jobs and St. John becomes somewhat closer to Jane. Okay, Jane also during this time finds out that her uncle John Eyre has died and has left his entire fortune of £20,000 to her in her name. So Jane wants to share this fortune with her sisters Diana and Mary and her brother St. John, and she wants to share this inheritance with them. And St. John also proposes marriage to Jane. Okay, this is where the fifth part of the novel will begin. In the fifth part, St. John, you see, he is very committed to his role as a clergyman. He's very committed to the church and he proposes marriage to Jane because he thinks that owing to her noble character, she will make a suitable missionary's wife. Okay, it is unclear to the reader whether St. John actually has any romantic feelings for Jane or he simply has a lot of affection for a noble character. Anyway, he offers to marry her and take her with him as part of his missionary activity to India where he is going. Jane initially rejects his offer. She rejects the marriage proposal and suggests that they travel as brother and sister instead. However, eventually her resolve begins to crumble. Okay, she has second thoughts about turning down St. John's proposal, and during this time she's also visited by a dream where she sees Mr. Rochester calling out her name. Okay, she returns to Thornfield Hall thereafter only to discover that it is now lying in ruins, blackened ruins. She learns that Rochester's wife, the first wife, Bertha Rochester, she had set the house on fire and committed suicide by jumping into the fire from the roof. In his rescue attempts, Mr. Rochester, he had tried to save the servants of the house from the fire and he has lost a hand and he has also lost his eyesight. Jane reunites with him, but he fears that she will be repulsed by his appearance. So he asks her, "Am I hideous now, Jane?" And Jane replies, "Well, sir, you always were, you know." And she declares that she still loves him. The two of them are finally married now that Bertha is dead. The two of them are finally married and the novel ends with Jane giving birth to their firstborn and Rochester has recovered enough sight to see their newborn son. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned, the important characters in the novel are of course the characters of Jane. Jane, as I've mentioned to you, she's of a passionate disposition. Okay. And she is the typical example of a self-made woman, a self-made bourgeois woman who eventually journeys to aristocracy. Okay, so this is very important. The novel became a crucial sort of text for second wave feminism because it is ultimately about a woman who attains her status in society through marriage, of course, but she attains her status in society. She rises from her very humble bourgeois moorings to a certain position of respect and she's a self-made woman. Okay, so Jane is of course the central character. She's the eponymous heroine or the central character in the novel, and she also is guided by a strong Christian morality. So she has a strong Christian ethical value which was instilled within her by the character whom I've already mentioned in my last lecture called Helen Burns. Okay, Additionally, Edward Rochester is also an important character. Rochester is as I've mentioned, he's the owner of Thornfield Hall. He's not particularly handsome. Even Jane is not beautiful. She's referred to as plain Jane throughout the novel. He wins Jane's heart because he feels that they're kindred spirits, okay? And the two of them, you see that their relationship is characterized throughout the novel as a relationship of equals. This is important to remember, that although there is a huge social sort of class that segregates the two, there's a huge social class difference, a class difference that segregates or separates the two of them are treated by Bronte as equals, okay? Rochester regrets his former libertinism and lustfulness. Nevertheless, he proves himself to be weaker in many ways than Jane. Okay. However, you see that he lies to her about the fact, he hides the fact of his first marriage from her. Okay. You see that towards the end of the novel, Rochester is also redeemed because he tries to save the servants of his house of Thornfield Hall from the fire, in which he loses one of his hands and his eyesight. Okay. Another important character in the novel is that of St. John Rivers, who is introduced to us in the fourth part of the novel during Jane's stay at Moor House. Okay. He is, as I mentioned, he is Jane's cousin, and he presents to us an important foil for Mr. Rochester. Okay. He is someone who is consumed by his passion to serve the institution of the church. Okay. He invites Jane to come with him to India as a missionary, as his wife, and he offers Jane the chance to make a more meaningful contribution to society than she would by being a housewife to an aristocrat. Okay. At the same time, Jane realizes that life with St. John would mean a life without true love, in which Jane's need for spiritual solace would be filled only by the retreat into the recesses of her own soul. So ultimately, she chooses Mr. Rochester. She chooses her independence over a life of service to the church. Okay, now this is crucial. Jane is also a very strong individualistic character. Okay, it's a rags to riches story. She is the bourgeois protagonist of the novel. She's also a character who is known, especially by in later feminist scholarship, who talk about Jane as a very strongly individualistic or autonomous figure, okay, who makes her own choices throughout the novel. Though she is committed to her Christian values, in the sense that she refuses to marry Rochester once she finds out that he's already married. She refuses to also become his mistress. She has a very strong Christian ethical value system. At the same time, she turns down St. John's proposal and chooses at the end of the novel, after Bertha is dead, to marry Rochester. Okay. Now, let us discuss about some of the important themes in the novel. Just give me a second. Yeah, just give me a second. Yeah. So, one of the important themes in the novel is the idea of love and autonomy. Okay, so this is a romantic novel at the core, and it is about the romance between the protagonist Jane, the eponymous protagonist, and between the owner of Thornfield Hall, Edward Rochester. However, as I've already mentioned, you see that Bronte gives us the impression that despite the class barrier between them, they are almost equals. Okay, they're kindred souls, so they're equals. Okay, and Jane is a very strong individualistic woman. She is noted for her individualism and for her autonomy. She makes her own choices throughout the novel. Okay, so this theme of love and autonomy, it serves as one of the important underscores. It's one of the important underscoring main themes of this particular novel. Okay, another important theme in this novel is that of social class. We see that Jane Eyre, the novel, and Charlotte Bronte, the author, was deeply critical of Georgian England's strict social hierarchy. Bronte's exploration of the complicated social position of governesses is perhaps the novel's most important treatment of this theme. Okay. Like the character of Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, Jane is a figure of ambiguous class standing and consequently a source of extreme tension for the characters around her. Her manners, her sophistication and education are those of an aristocrat, because Victorian governesses who tutored children in etiquette as well as academics. Okay. So, although her mannerisms and etiquette are those of an aristocrat, she does not have the class of an aristocrat. Yet, as paid employees, they were more or less treated as servants, okay? So, thus, Jane remains penniless and powerless while at Thornfield Hall. And I've told you that this novel is very important. It's a very crucial novel for second wave feminism, because ultimately, it is Jane's decision, Jane's choice of first rejecting Rochester, then agreeing to marry him. Okay, so it's about her sort of journey from a very humble class background to the sort of her rise into aristocracy. Okay, so the idea of social class is very important. Also, gender relations present an important theme in this novel, as Jane struggles continually to achieve equality and to overcome oppression. We see there's a class hierarchy, as I've already mentioned in this novel. She must also fight against patriarchal domination, against those who believe women to be inferior to men and try to treat them as such. 3 male characters threaten her desire for equality and dignity. One is Mr. Brocklehurst, the harsh headmaster of Lowood Institution, Edward Rochester himself, and St. John Rivers. All 3 are on some level misogynistic. Okay? Each tries to keep Jane in a submissive position where she is unable to express her own thoughts and feelings in her quest for independence and self-knowledge. Jane must escape Brocklehurst. She must reject the proposal of St. John and come to Rochester only after ensuring that they get married as equals. This is important, okay? She chooses to marry Rochester a second time. She sort of, the first time their marriage is broken. The second time when she chooses to marry Rochester, she agrees to his proposal. She only agrees because now she's equal to him. This last condition is met once Jane proves herself able to function through the time she spends at Moor House in a community and in a family. Remember, by this time she has also inherited the fortunes, £20,000 of her uncle John Eyre. Okay, so she agrees to marry Rochester only when the two of them are equals. Okay, furthermore, Rochester is blind at the novel's end and thus dependent upon Jane to be his prop and his guide. Okay, and in chapter 12, Jane, I'm quoting Jane, she articulates what was for her a time, at that particular time, this was example of her feminist philosophy. Okay, I'm quoting Jane. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidery bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. So this was a very strong, this statement, particularly for second wave feminism. Okay. Now, interestingly, the character of the madwoman or Bertha Antoinette Rochester, who is Rochester's first wife, she presents an interesting alter ego to the character of Jane. Okay. This novel was rewritten, not exactly rewritten, but this novel became the subject of a famous adaptation, a post-colonial feminist adaptation called White Sargasso Sea, which was written in 1966 by this author called Jean Rhys. Okay, now White Sargasso Sea, it is a sort of retelling of the story of Jane Eyre from the point of view of Bertha Antoinette Rochester. Okay, we see that she's a Dominican-born Creole heiress, and she marries Rochester. Okay, and it talks about her journey. And you know, when you look at sort of Jean Rhys's adaptation or Jean Rhys's retelling, you would see that how Jane's liberation from her social class, her liberation, her sort of feminist liberation comes at the cost of the subsumption or the effacing of the agency of the post-colonial woman. Okay, it's a very complex sort of analysis, but remember that this madwoman in the attic, that of Bertha or Antoinette Rochester, she becomes a very important character. Later feminist critics, including Gilbert and Gubar, in their sort of book, Mad Woman in the Attic, have discussed this figure, okay, this silent woman figure who is locked up in the attic, okay, and even Jane's own self-liberation as a feminist heroine, as a second wave feminist heroine, comes at the cost of the effacing of the subjectivity of another woman, the post-colonial woman, the woman who comes from the colony, the character called Bertha Antoinette Rochester, okay. So these are some of the important themes that we see in this novel, that we read about in this novel. And in another lecture, I'll be discussing the important symbols, and I'll be discussing some of these characters in greater detail.